Okay, the next problem on the list is E41. E41 asks us to take a number of different T accounts and then create an adjusted trial balance with those T accounts, okay? Since there was a voluminous number of T accounts, I've instead put this on the computer as opposed to writing all of it out on the chalkboard. I think it'll be clearer for you and easier for me to just place it on the computer. When we're making our trial balance, I want you to note that the first thing here that we have at the top is the header, okay? We have the top, the company name. We're writing out the report. Here we show an adjusted trial balance. Notice in the previous chapter, for chapter 3, we did an unadjusted trial balance. Here we have an adjusted trial balance. And notice it's as of a certain date. It's as of December 31st, 2012, okay? After that, we then have to list the accounts out in the appropriate order. Well, to determine the order, we talked about this last time, but at the top here, you notice that you have the balance sheet section, okay? And I'm going to highlight dividends declared. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but for right now, I'm just going to highlight it. Here we have the balance sheet section, okay? Here we have the balance sheet section. Notice that assets are at the top. Then we have, these are current assets, non-current assets. We have liabilities, current liabilities up here, and non-current liabilities starting right here, and then stockholders' equity listed down here, okay? One of the things I want to note about dividends declared. Dividends declared is a temporary account. This temporary account will close into retained earnings. Remember we talked in chapter 4 about closing journal entries. Closing journal entries take all of the temporary account activities and close them into retained earnings. So you increase or decrease the balance of retained earnings depending on the activity, whether you're looking at an expense or looking at a revenue or looking at dividends, okay? You close that activity into retained earnings, okay? But an important point to note is that on an adjusted trial balance, the balance in retained earnings is considered as of the beginning of the year. This is as of the beginning of the year or beginning of the period, whatever period you're looking at. Why? Because as of the adjusted trial balance point, you have not yet made the closing journal entries. Retained earnings won't change until you close the accounts into it. Therefore, the retained earning balance shown here is going to be as of the beginning of the period because we haven't made closing journal entries. How do I know that we haven't made closing journal entries? Well, I can just simply look at the temporary accounts we have listed here and see that there's a balance. Therefore, there must have not been any closing journal entries made, or each one of these balances would be 0 in the temporary account. So let's look at some of those temporary accounts. The next accounts that you should have listed down in the order are the income statement accounts. You have service revenue here, other revenue, and then you go on to all the expenses here. I'm going to highlight the service revenue as well. Okay, and this makes up your income statement. Notice you have revenues at the top here, and then the rest of the expenses are listed out. The dividends declared account, and then all of the income statement accounts, they're all considered temporary or nominal accounts. At the end of the period, when you're ready to make the financial statement, after you've made the financial statements for the income statement, but then you're ready to make the financial statement for the balance sheet, and you want to increase the retained earnings account, okay, by the factor of net income, and decrease it by the factor of dividends declared, you have to close all of these temporary accounts into retained earnings, okay? Revenue obviously increases retained earnings. Expenses would obviously decrease retained earnings. But remember when we talked about the equations all the way back in chapter 1, we said to get the retained earnings ending balance, we start with beginning balance, we add net income, we subtract dividends, and that gives us the ending balance. Well, how do we get net income? It's simply revenue minus expenses, right? So right here you can see that we're taking net income by taking the service revenue and the other revenue and then all the expense accounts, and we close those into retained earnings. We would effectively be closing net income into retained earnings. We would then do another journal entry to close dividends declared into retained earnings. All of these accounts being temporary accounts, okay? But the thing I want you to note is that at the point at which you have an adjusted trial balance, we have not done that. We have not yet made closing journal entries. Therefore, retained earnings represents the beginning balance, okay? Beginning balance at the beginning of the period. So it's December 31st, 2011 in this example, not 2012, okay? Now, how do we get retained earnings? Because that was a figure that we weren't given in this problem, okay? Well, when using a trial balance, we know that the debit side and the credit side have to adjusted balance. Therefore, the retained earnings was simply calculated as a plug figure. What was the difference between the debit and the credit? We know that retained earnings has a credit balance, so it needs to be on the right-hand side. So we simply took the difference between the debit and the credits, and then that was the figure that we put in retained earnings, okay? Requirement 2 asks you to denote whether or not the retained earnings balance was as of December 31st, 2011 or 2012. And as we talked about just a few moments ago, this balance right here in the adjusted trial balance is as of December 31st, 2011 because we have not yet made closing journal entries. Once we make the closing journal entries, the retained earnings balance will then change to December 31st, 2012. Please let me know if you have any questions on this problem.